Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 6, about interest groups and political parties. And this is Lesson 14, about why there are two major political parties in the United States of America, rather than 3 or 4 or whatever. In this lesson, you'll learn about the concept of proportional representation, about the idea of single-member districts. You'll learn about restricted ballot access, and about realigning elections. So what we're mainly addressing in this lesson is the question of why we only have two major political parties in the United States of America. The simple answer to that question is, well, actually it's not very simple, is that the way that we determine winners in the United States of America. We use what is sometimes characterized as a winner-takes-all single-member district system. Basically what this means is that in an election in the United States of America, how many winners do we have? We have one winner for each election. And each separate district or election area has its own winner. Now, if you grew up in the United States of America, that may seem obvious that, well, that's the way elections are. Well, there are other ways to do elections, and if you understand the other potential ways to do elections, then you can begin to understand why the single-member district system used in the United States of America produces just two major political parties. The other main way to elect people is through what is called a proportional representation system. So to explain single-member district voting, I'm going to first explain proportional representation, and then we'll talk about single-member districts, and we'll see how the two compare, and from that, it'll emerge why we have just two major political parties. Now, notice that I'm using a different color scheme here for both. The different colors here will be used in the background of the slides from this point forward until we finish this explanation, so you can keep track of what we're talking about at a given time. If you see the greenish background, you know that we're talking about proportional representation. If you see that yellowish background, you know that we're talking about winner-takes-all single-member district system. So let's begin talking about proportional representation by considering election results. Okay, so we're going to have an election, and let's imagine that the voters in that election are represented by this white box. Well, in a proportional representation system, as the voters in that white box cast their votes, they probably aren't casting, in most cases, a vote for an individual politician. Instead, they're casting a vote for a particular political party. So it's really party results that we're looking at in an election result in a proportional representation system. So let's just use a hypothetical example of how this might turn out. Say we have a vote, and 30% of the votes cast go for one party, 40% for another, and 20% for another, and 10% for another. The question then is, who won? In a proportional representation system, they're all winners. Well, in a sense, they all are. What I mean by that is they all got something for their vote. Well, what did they get for their vote? That can be understood if you keep in mind what it is that they're trying to win. In a typical situation where they're out voting in a proportional representation system, they are voting for seats, positions in some sort of legislature. They could call it a Congress, they could call it a parliament, they could call it an assembly, whatever it is they're calling it. It's some sort of representative government. And there are seats in it, represented by this white rectangle. So the people went out and voted for various political parties. We totaled up the vote and found that one party got 30%, one 40%, etc. Now the question is, how do we then assign the seats in the legislature? In a proportional representation system, in the most basic way of doing it, the seats in the parliament are assigned in accordance to the percentages in the actual vote. So what we mean by this is if a party gets 30% of the vote, it gets 30% of the seats in the legislature. 40% of the vote, 40% of the seats. 10% of the vote, 10% of the seats. Now this is what is meant by them all winning. They all got something for their efforts. And because they got something for their efforts, they will continue to try to win in future elections. The party that only gets 10% of the vote then may keep trying, and maybe the next election they'll get 20, and the election after that 30, etc. They have something to build on. So what happens, though, is once they get elected and the seats are divided up, oftentimes there will not be a majority actually in the legislature. In our example here, the party with the most seats in the legislature only has 40. So they can't really control what happens. So in order to actually rule, to have a majority, you're going to have multiple political parties then combine in what are called coalitions. So they wait to see what the election results are, and then they figure out who has the most seats, who has next, that kind of thing. And then parties start bargaining with each other, and eventually 1, 2, maybe 3 of them are able to form a group that's a majority, and then they become the ruling group in the country. So you have parties that come together to work after the election. In a proportional representation system, the way they do elections, because everyone gets something for their efforts, there's no reason for them to drop out before the election actually happens. So the way they form a ruling group is the parties form post-election coalitions. That's where the incentives are in that system. Now let's compare this to what happens in a single-member district system. Now remember, we got the yellow background so we can see that. Again, we go back to looking at election results. And we're going to look at the voting that takes place, represented by this blank white rectangle to begin with. And we're going to see how it gets divided up. But let's remember, in a single-member district system, rather than voting for parties, you're going to be voting for candidates. There's only one winner. So let's imagine in a scenario that in a particular election, 40% of the voters vote for a candidate of one party. 30% voted for the candidates of another party, 20% for the candidate of another party, etc. Well, in this sort of system, who wins? In our winner-takes-all system, whoever gets the most votes wins, and they are the only winner. The party that ran a candidate that only got 30% of the vote gets nothing for their effort. The one that ran 20%, nothing for their effort, etc. Well, what did that one winner get? Well, again, we have to look at what they were trying to achieve. They were trying to achieve a seat in a legislature. Remember, single-member district, it's about winner takes all, about in each election, there's only one winner running for one seat. So notice now, unlike when we were talking about proportional representation, where I talked about seats in Parliament, plural, now we're talking about a single seat in the legislature for that one particular race, for this one particular group of candidates. So what happens is the person that got the most votes entirely wins that single seat. There's only one winner, and that person gets everything. Now, let's think about what kind of incentives that then creates for the political parties that are involved. Let's go back to the party results by themselves. Remember, the candidate of one party got 40%, candidate of another party got 30%, etc. Let's imagine that these kind of results were to persist in the future, in future elections. Then the parties that are getting 30 or 20%, they're getting nothing for their efforts. Nothing. They're never going to win anything. So for that reason, it might make sense for them to combine with one of the other parties. In this example, if we get the party that has 20%, the party that has 30% to work together, to both work together to elect the same candidate. Notice now that both their boxes are colored in red, representing them supporting the same candidate. Then we've got 50% behind that one candidate from these two political parties. Effectively, they have joined together to create a winner. And that winner then gets the single seat in the legislature. So in a single-member district, winner-takes-all kind of election system, there's an incentive for the political parties to actually combine before the election to try to form coalitions then that can create a majority to actually win the single seat that's available in each election spread around among district, all over the country. So, what we saw from that then is that with an incentive for the smaller parties to combine, we end up inevitably in a single member district, winner takes all system, with them combining where there are only two major political parties left that always fight it out with each other. In the United States of America, those are represented by the Republican and Democratic Party. Now the next question should be, okay, I understand why we may have two political parties, because our single member district system, there's only ever one winner, and so there's an incentive to combine beforehand to try to get enough votes to be the winner, and so you end up with two big groups all combined together fighting it out with each other that both have almost 50% of the vote. They are the major parties that almost win. You understand that. But the question is, why are these the two political parties that are left? Well, there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is tradition. They've been around for a long time. One is just momentum. They're the winners, and therefore the winners get the donations. They're the ones that continue to have the money. Because they're the winners, they continue to attract the best candidates to be part of their organization. There's all these kind of things happening. But there are also some very specific structural things in place that help these political parties be the winners. One of those is something called ballot access. If the parties that are in charge make it harder for other parties to get on the ballot, they can help perpetuate their own power. And here in the United States of America, that happens. There are three basic ways to get on a ballot, and you'll see how these favor the big parties. The first way to get on a ballot is what's called past performance. Most places in the country, when they set rules for elections, a candidate automatically gets on the ballot if that candidate is representing a political party that got a certain percentage of the vote in the previous election. And guess what? That percentage is usually written so it's just the two major political parties that get it. Maybe a few of the other minor parties that do well are possible, depending on how the rules are written. But usually it's just the two major parties. So the two major parties always automatically get on the ballot. Whoever they nominate is going to be in the election. They don't have to go through the trouble that other political parties would to get on the ballot, to have their name there. Well, what sort of trouble do the other parties have to go through? If they don't automatically get put on for past performance, what do they have to do? Well, one way they can get on the ballot is by gathering signatures. In some states, this may require them to go out and physically get tens of thousands of people to write their names on petitions asking that this person be put on the ballot. Now imagine how hard this is. You're a brand new political party, nobody's heard of you, you're going up to strangers on the street and saying, hey, we are the new American Century Party or whatever, and we're running Bob Smith for Senate. Will you sign this piece of paper so we can get him on the ballot? Nobody even knows who you are. They have no idea who your candidate is. Why would they want to help you with that? So this is a difficult process to go through. Sometimes there's an alternative where a party can just simply pay an amount of money to get on a ballot. But again, this is difficult. If you're a brand new party starting, you don't have a bunch of money laying around just to buy your way onto ballots, while the major parties are just getting on automatically. So these systems for getting access to the ballot actually make it difficult for other parties to get on the ballot. So while we have these two major parties, and they kind of have an advantage of being there, we next ask ourselves, well, must they always be the only two parties? Is there any way to possibly change this? Well, we could possibly change it, and if we ever did, that would be what is known as a realigning election. A realigning election is when the ruling coalition, in other words, the group that's kind of in charge, that's persistently been in power, is somehow changed. A new ruling coalition comes into power. A really good example of this in American history is when the New Deal Democrats came into power in 1932. The Great Depression had gotten going. A lot of American voters blamed the Republicans for that. The Republicans had been in charge for some time. They had generally elected the president. They had controlled the Congress. We were, for the most part, a Republican-run country. And then the Republicans got wiped out in the election because they were blamed for the Great Depression. And the Democrats, who had been the minority party, swept in as the majority party, and they held a majority in Congress for basically the next 60 years. This was a realigning election. We changed from a predominantly Republican national government to a predominantly Democratic national government. Now, that doesn't mean every single person in the government was a Republican or a Democrat in those two situations, but on average, usually, the majority became members of this new political party that was in charge rather than the former one. Sometimes realigning elections create an entirely new party system. In other words, we don't have the same two political parties anymore. The change is so dramatic that you don't just end up with a new group in charge, but one of the previous groups gets wiped out. We'll look at some examples of this from our history. The first party system came into being in 1796. This was shortly after the Constitution came into effect. George Washington had been elected president. He was getting elected at this point for the second time. Or excuse me, he'd been elected twice. Now he's retired. Sorry, we got my history only a little bit wrong there for a moment. He had been elected twice. He had retired, and John Adams was then running for president as his successor, as a member of the group called the Federalists. Well, an opposition rose up against them, who called themselves Republicans. And for the next several elections, it was the Federalists fighting it out with the Republicans. Well, eventually, the Republicans so defeated the Federalists that the Federalists were wiped out as a political party. By 1820, there was only one political party left, the Republicans. This is the party that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, people like that. But when they were the only political party left, because of our system, single-member districts, winner takes all, there's room at the top for two. And this political party began to split apart into different factions. One of those groups became known as the Democratic Republicans. Well, there was this time period when the Republicans were fighting amongst each other, and they were the only major political party in the country. But that didn't last. By 1836, an opposition political party had risen up. They called themselves the Whigs. And the leftover of the Democratic Republicans had become known under the name Democrats. So the Democratic Party that we know today originally began with the name Republicans, and it evolved over time. So then we had Whigs versus Democrats. But by 1856, the Whigs had disappeared, and the new Republican Party had come into power. So at that point then, we have Republicans against Democrats, and those are the labels that we've had on the parties ever since. So I tell you this history just to show you that it's possible for the political parties of today to disappear and new political parties to take their place. But a lesson from this to be drawn is that for a new major party to emerge, it must replace one of the existing parties. There's only room for two parties at the top in our system. To have a new party, we have to kill off one of the two that are already there. So now let's review what you learned in this lesson. What is the impact from proportional representation? Is it that we have single party rule, or two major parties, or several major parties, or a compromise before every election? The thing that you really get from proportional representation is that you have several major parties. And the compromise between those parties actually takes place after the election usually. What is the impact from single member districts? Is it that we have single party rule, or two major parties, or several major parties, or compromise after the election? In single member districts, we have two major political parties. The compromise actually takes place before the election as various groups combine together to try to create majority parties. How does a party not obtain ballot access in the United States of America? Do they get ballot access from a grant from a governor, or past performance, or collective signatures, or by paying a fee? 3 of those are true and 1 isn't. The one that's not correct is a governor simply granting and putting parties on the ballot. They do the other things to get on the ballot. Finally, what may change during a realigning election? Are new political boundaries created? Is there a new constitutional structure? Is there new voting technology used? Or do we have a new major political party? A realigning election may create a new major political party. That completes this lesson. It was lesson 13 of Unit 6. The next one will be lesson 14 of Unit 6, the final lesson of Unit 6. And in that lesson, we'll talk about how the two major political parties differ.